The American Revolution may have secured America's independence, but it didn't exactly secure America's freedom. For that, the United States would have to fight a second, mostly forgotten war, a war it was shockingly unprepared to fight, and by all accounts, probably should have lost. This is the story of the War of 1812. It's a strange and confusing conflict, often overshadowed by the Revolution before it and the Civil War that came after. And yet, this forgotten war was a brutal, pivotal struggle that could have ended the United States just as it was getting started. In the process, it would forge the very identity of a nation. In 1812, the United States of America wasn't so much a nation as it was a fragile experiment. Only a few decades had passed since the country's founding, and the united part was questionable. The population was tiny, just 7.5 million people scattered across a huge, untamed continent. And the military? It was laughably small. The army was poorly trained, badly equipped, and led by aging, often incompetent, veterans of the Revolution. The political scene was just as messy. The country was bitterly divided. In power were the Democratic Republicans, led by President James Madison. Their support came from the South and the Western frontier. In opposition were the Federalists, based in the commercial hubs of the Northeast. The Federalists saw a war with Great Britain as pure economic suicide. Their entire livelihood depended on maritime trade, and they were so fiercely against the war that some in New England were quietly talking about making a separate peace with Britain, or even seceding from the Union. So when a group of young, aggressive congressmen known as the War Hawks started clamoring for a fight, they were pushing for a war the country was in no shape to wage. Led by charismatic figures like Henry Clay, they argued that American honor was on the line. They saw war not just as a way to defend American rights, but as a golden opportunity to expand. Many of them believed that conquering British Canada would be, as Thomas Jefferson famously put it, a mere matter of marching. They were about to be proven very, very wrong. This divided, unprepared nation was about to gamble its entire existence by declaring war on the most powerful empire on earth. The road to war wasn't sparked by a single event, but by a long series of insults and aggressions that had been chipping away at American pride for years. At the center of it all was the epic struggle raging across Europe between Great Britain and Napoleonic France. The United States just wanted to stay neutral and trade with everybody, but it found itself stuck right in the middle. The most infuriating issue was the British practice of impressment. The Royal Navy was always short on sailors for its massive fleet, so it claimed the right to stop American ships and search for deserters. In reality, this meant British gangs would board American vessels and basically kidnap sailors. They claimed these men were British subjects, but the difference between an American and a British accent was often ignored by officers desperate for manpower. Thousands of American citizens were stolen from their own ships and forced into the brutal life of a British sailor. The U.S. State Department tracked over 6,000 cases, but the real number was likely much higher. This wasn't just a labor dispute, it was an assault on the very meaning of American citizenship. Adding to the anger were Britain's crippling trade rules. To choke Napoleon's economy, Britain blockaded Europe, which brought American commerce to a grinding halt. American ships were seized, their cargo was taken, and their sailors were impressed. It felt less like a wartime measure and more like Britain trying to put its former colony back in its economic place. But the fight wasn't just on the high seas. On the American frontier, another conflict was brewing. The British wanted to slow down America's westward expansion, so they armed and supported Native American tribes. From forts in Canada, they funneled weapons to a powerful alliance of tribes led by the visionary Shawnee chief Tecumseh. Tecumseh was a brilliant strategist and speaker who argued that no single tribe could sell land that belonged to all native peoples. He built a confederacy to resist the American advance. When Americans on the frontier saw native warriors carrying British muskets, they didn't see a fight for indigenous sovereignty. They saw a British plot to attack them from the west. When President Madison finally asked Congress to declare war on June 1, 1812, these were the main charges: impressment, illegal blockades, and stirring up hostilities on the frontier. The vote was the closest war declaration in American history, a perfect reflection of the divided nation that was stumbling into battle. The American plan for winning the war was breathtakingly optimistic and, as it turned out, a complete disaster. The whole strategy depended on a quick, multi-pronged invasion of Canada. The Warhawks were convinced the Canadians would greet them as liberators. They were not. The first disaster was led by General William Hull, who invaded from Detroit in July 1812. His campaign was a masterclass in hesitation and incompetence. Fearing he was outnumbered by a force of British soldiers and Tecumseh's warriors, Hull quickly retreated back to Detroit. There, in a moment of shocking disgrace, he surrendered the entire fort and his 2,500 men after barely putting up a fight. It was a humiliating gut punch to American morale right at the start. The other invasions didn't go any better. An attack across the Niagara River at Queenston Heights fell apart when the New York militia refused to cross the border to help, arguing their job was only to defend their own state, not invade another country. A third invasion aimed at Montreal just fizzled out, as that army's militia also refused to leave U.S. territory. The grand invasion of Canada was an absolute fiasco, thanks to determined defenders and America's own stunning disorganization. But the absolute low point came in the summer of 1814. Napoleon had been defeated in Europe, allowing Britain to send thousands of its best troops to North America. Their target? The nation's capital, Washington, D.C. In August, British forces landed and met a panicked, poorly organized American militia at the Battle of Bladensburg. The Americans quickly broke and ran. On August 24, 1814, British troops marched into a defenseless Washington. As payback for an earlier American raid that burned parts of York, modern-day Toronto, the British decided to do the same. They torched the Capitol building. They marched to the president's mansion, where officers reportedly held a mock feast with the dinner that had been set for President Madison before setting the building on fire. President Madison and his government fled into the night, fugitives from their own capital. It was a profound national humiliation. As the flames lit up the sky, it looked like the war was lost, and maybe the country right along with it. Out of the ashes of Washington, however, something began to change. While the Army was getting crushed on land, the tiny U.S. Navy was punching way above its weight. On the high seas, powerful American frigates like the USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, were winning stunning one-on-one duels against the supposedly invincible Royal Navy, giving the country some desperately needed good news. But the most important naval victories weren't on the ocean, they were on the Great Lakes. Whoever controlled these lakes controlled the entire western frontier. In September 1813, a small American fleet under Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry met a British squadron on Lake Erie. After a savage fight, Perry scribbled one of the most famous messages in military history: "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." That victory secured the American Northwest and forced the British to abandon Detroit. During the British retreat, American forces led by William Henry Harrison caught up with them. At the Battle of the Thames, Tecumseh was killed. His death shattered his native alliance and was a devastating blow to the resistance against American expansion. A year later, after burning Washington, the British set their sights on the much more valuable port of Baltimore. The key to the city's defense was Fort McHenry. On September 13, 1814, British warships began a relentless 25-hour bombardment. Rockets and bombs rained down on the fort, shaking the city. Forced to watch from a British ship in the harbor was a young American lawyer named Francis Scott Key. As the battle raged through the night, he could only see the red glare of the rockets and hear the bombs bursting in air. When dawn finally broke, Key peered through the smoke expecting to see the British flag. Instead, he saw the huge American flag still flying over the fort. It had survived. Overwhelmed, Key started writing a poem on the back of a letter. He called it Defense of Fort McHenry. We know it today as the Star-Spangled Banner. The defense of Baltimore wasn't just a military victory. It gave the nation a symbol of pure, stubborn resilience. Even as the country celebrated, the British were planning one last massive attack. Their target was New Orleans, the gateway to the Mississippi River and the entire American heartland. In charge of the city's defense was a man who would become a legend, Major General Andrew Jackson. Jackson was tough, ruthless, and had an iron will. He got to New Orleans in December 1814 and immediately declared martial law. He then cobbled together one of the most diverse armies ever seen: U.S. regulars, Tennessee and Kentucky riflemen, local Creole militia, a battalion of free black soldiers, Choctaw warriors, and even a gang of pirates under the notorious Jean Lafitte. Jackson had his men build a massive earthwork, later known as Line Jackson. On the morning of January 8, 1815, the British commander, Sir Edward Pakenham, made a fatal mistake. He completely underestimated Jackson and ordered a full frontal assault against the fortified American line. It was a massacre. As the disciplined lines of redcoats marched across the open field, they were torn apart by a storm of American artillery and rifle fire. The attack collapsed into chaos. Within an hour, it was over. The British suffered over 2,000 casualties, including Pakenham himself. Jackson's forces? They lost fewer than 100. It was a stunning, lopsided American victory. But here's the great tragic irony of the Battle of New Orleans. It happened after the war was technically over. 2 weeks earlier, on Christmas Eve 1814, American and British diplomats in Ghent, Belgium, had already signed a peace treaty. But news traveled slowly back then, and the treaty had not yet been ratified by the U.S. government, so the war was not officially over. The battle had no effect on the outcome of the war, but its psychological impact was enormous. News of Jackson's incredible victory hit the East Coast around the same time as the peace treaty. It allowed Americans to feel like they had won the war in a blaze of glory, and it turned Andrew Jackson into a national hero overnight. The Treaty of Ghent, which officially ended the war in February 1815, was weird. It basically declared the whole thing a draw. All conquered territory was to be returned, and the old borders were restored. The hilarious part? The treaty didn't mention impressment or neutral trading rights, the very issues that supposedly started the war. On paper, it looked like nothing had been accomplished. But the real results of the war weren't on paper. They were in the American spirit. The fact that the U.S. had stood up to the British Empire and fought it to a standstill unleashed a massive wave of patriotism. This era of good feelings saw the collapse of the Federalist Party, whose opposition to the war now looked treasonous. For the first time, people started thinking of themselves not just as New Yorkers or Virginians, but as Americans. It really was a second war of independence, one that confirmed the nation's freedom in its own mind. The war had other legacies, too. The British blockade forced American industry to become more self-sufficient, kickstarting manufacturing. It created new American heroes like Andrew Jackson and gave us the Star-Spangled Banner. But for Britain's Native American allies, the war was an absolute catastrophe. With Tecumseh gone and the British no longer supporting them, their ability to resist American expansion was broken, opening the floodgates of settlement at a terrible cost. And finally, the treaty laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the world's longest peaceful border between the U.S. and Canada. The War of 1812 was messy, contradictory, and far more important than we usually remember. It was a war the United States nearly lost, but from which it emerged with a new sense of national identity and purpose. It proved to the world, and more importantly to itself, that the United States was a real nation, capable of defending its freedom and forging its own destiny. If you found this story of America's forgotten war interesting, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. And let us know in the comments, what other overlooked historical event should we tackle next? Thanks for watching.